Okay, the YouTube stream is running. The other thing is running. You should be good to go.
Great, many thanks, Richard. So welcome everybody to the panel at this year's workshop on the economics of information security. We originally planned to hold WEIS in Brussels so that we could interact with the European institutions. And as we've been forced to hold it offline, we sat down and scratched our heads and figured out what should we do. So our general chair, Lorenzo Pupillo, suggested that we have a panel bringing together people from European institutions with people from US government institutions. And this is particularly apt for a couple of reasons. The first is that the European Union has just recently set out its pitch for renewing trade and other links with the USA and with the other democracies as a pitch to the incoming Biden administration. And the second is that, as Lorenzo pointed out in his introduction, there's going to be a new initiative on cybersecurity launched in the European Union tomorrow. In addition to that, we have seen over the past few days a couple of incidents which bring to mind the way in which we're all interdependent nowadays when it comes to vulnerabilities, namely the FireEye tool theft and the SolarWinds incident. So in order to discuss these issues of mutual dependence, we've got four panelists. We've got Ruth Udaiken from the Federal Trade Commission, Alan Friedman from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, Aristotelis Tsafarias from DG Connect, and also Christian de Cunha from DC Connect. And how we're going to run this panel is that I'm going to invite each of the panelists to speak first for 7 minutes or so in order to set the scene. And we'll then speak briefly amongst ourselves, and we'll then open the floor to questions. Questions will have to come through the chat because we've got too many people for me to see people raising their hands on the screen in front of me. So first of all, Ruth Udaiken from the Federal Trade Commission. Ruth, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to do a little something in the corner there. Yeah. Oh. Sorry, I'm just trying to clear that up. Okay. So first, thank you very much for having me here. I am with the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C. I have to give a disclaimer that my views today are my own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the Commission or any particular commissioner. So I wanted to talk a little bit first about the FTC itself and how it fits into this larger cybersecurity puzzle. And then talk a little bit about some of the things we do that I think are relevant to the work you all are doing and the conversations today and tomorrow. The Federal Trade Commission is an agency that works on a portion, again, of cybersecurity. We do that through law enforcement, and that's how we're incentivizing companies. We also have a role in providing some forums for people to talk about emerging issues. We try to do research to inform the work we're doing, and we try to work with businesses and consumers to inform them about items that could be helpful related to the work that we do. We have primarily a consumer protection and competition mission, and I'm talking primarily about this consumer protection mission here because it's most relevant to what you're talking about right now. We do not have a sector that we're responsible for. So unlike different agencies, the Communications Commission or agencies that look at medical devices, we are looking at a really broad spectrum of devices and services that are offered by businesses. And we are talking about the relationship between the consumer and the business, and sometimes businesses to each other. We're really looking to make sure that that relationship is fair, and that's what we're looking at. So we have, just not to get too much into the law, we have a general law. It prohibits deceptive or unfair practices in commerce. And we use that for a lot of different areas. I will note that a lot of states also have a similar law, often referred to as the UDAP law. There are, as I mentioned, sector-specific agencies that have more detailed regulations, but what we are primarily doing is we're saying to businesses, we're not going to tell you what technology to use. We're not going to tell you how the business model should work. We just have some basic standards that we're going to apply in different circumstances. And this is, there are some exceptions, of course. We have financial and children's data that we look at more carefully. We've brought many cases. We've brought, I think the numbers are over 70 privacy cases. We divided into privacy, 80 data security cases. We've brought more than 100 spyware and spam cases, and we're looking at everything from, you know, lamps to laptops to COVID scam cases to, you know, anything you can really think of. So these are just to give you examples of what we look at. Again, very often we're focused on disclosures, so they're very important here. It's what a company says to the consumer when they're inviting them to get the service or product. And these are some examples. We do a lot of work in IoT devices. We had recently announced a settlement with a smart lock company, which said that it was, its device was designed to be impenetrable or something like that. And also it said that it met certain data security standards, state of the art. Also, you know, we recently announced a settlement with Zoom. One of the items in there was that Zoom had made some statements about the level of encryption it used. And we said it was deceptive and misleading, and staff has come to a settlement with Zoom. So those are just some of the areas that we look at. I also want to note that we do, as I mentioned, a lot of work with different communities trying to learn about issues and to spread the word. And these include repair restrictions, items that are related to the kind of issues you're talking about when you talk about vulnerabilities. And we also solicit research on privacy, and a call for that should be coming out soon. So, and we try to, as I said, educate businesses. Okay, so that's that, and I think that is my time.
Great, many thanks, Ruth. That's a very good starter. I think many people in Europe are unaware of the fact that privacy regulation in America is actually founded on truth in advertising law. We tend to found our laws on human rights, as I'm sure our EU colleagues will be discussing in just a short moment. But next up is Annan Friedman, and you're from a different arm of the US government, with which I think our European colleagues will be less familiar. So why don't you introduce yourself and your mission?
Sure. Thank you, Ross. And it's wonderful to talk to this community. My first year of grad school was actually the first workshop on the economics of information security. So I grew up intellectually studying from the leadership of Ross and Larry and Bruce and many in this community. So it's an honor to be back here as someone who's trying to implement a lot of the ideas behind incentives and economics and security. So I'm from the U.S. Department of Commerce, a tiny little part called NTIA, which unfortunately is in the news this weekend. But the Department of Commerce you can think of as the folks that try to help businesses do things. And that's everything from technical standards to tell you what the weather is to help you with exports. And my little corner thinks about telecom policy and internet policy. And so I've been in government now for almost 6 years, and really focusing on this idea that there are real market failures in security, and what can the government do about them? Well, you know, the traditional tools we have are the carrot and the stick. And unfortunately, I don't have a budget, so I can't pay anyone to do anything. And Congress did not see fit to empower me to force anyone to do things. And in fact, I'll talk a little more about the challenge of that in a moment. So the tool I have is when the US government announces that we're going to talk about certain things, there's a general class of people that sort of have to pay attention. Right? These are your professional lobbyists. And once I have them, I can go out and get some other folks. And so convening is a real power that shouldn't be overlooked in policy making, especially if you sort of think about it from an economic perspective, because with the focus I try to keep is how do we make it easier and cheaper to do the right thing? We have a lot of expectations. And I feel often, even if the incentives are perfect, that doesn't help us solve the problem. So suppose we just say, hey, if a company has a data breach, we're going to remove the left pinky of the CEO's hand. Well, that would create a pretty strong incentive. But would that today actually empower those organizations to prevent data breaches? They would have to sort of still say, well, okay, the CEO turns to the CISO, turns to the CFO, turns to the COO. Well, what are the tools they would have, and how do we measure whether or not they work and things like that? So incentives are a very big part of the story, but also making sure that they have the tools that aren't just technical. They're technical and they're business tools and they're operational tools to sort of think about what this looks like. So over the past few years, I've had some fun tackling some interesting issues. It was the first time that any large government had, when I first joined, we decided to pick on vulnerability disclosure. And those of you who know the history of WEIS know that that's a very time-honored research question. We spent many years debating full disclosure versus local disclosure. But the government had never said, hey, let's put large companies and hackers in a room and have them talk. And so we successfully managed to do that. It was a very exciting time, right? This used to be a very controversial issue. And we've, I think, did some good initial work to help people think about what does multi-party disclosure look like and how do we facilitate that. And indeed, here are some template disclosure policies so that organizations, especially safety critical organizations, can begin to learn how to work with security researchers, and researchers can begin to learn how to work with companies. So essentially, and that I think has been picked up and used in things like some great research that Lorenzo led at CEPS a few years ago. We've done some work on IoT security. We talk about the importance of patching. And so what we did is we brought together the security community and the device manufacturer community and said, hey, when you say something's patchable, what do you mean? Because there was actually some industry guidance out there that said level 1 assurance means that you need to have security updates, remote security updates. Level 3 security, the highest level of security, means you need to be able to validate a cryptographic signature. Do you guys know what you call a software update mechanism that's not cryptographically verified? It's called RCE, and those are bad. So right, we tried to sort of create some general ways of thinking about it. And the current work that I'm doing that I'm really excited about and has a lot of relevance to what's in the headlines today, is something called software bill of materials. This is the idea that you go to the store, you buy a piece of candy, it comes with a list of ingredients. Why don't we expect the same from our software? And part of what we had to do is understand why we don't have this today, because someone tried to do it in regulation a few years ago, and the IT industry nuked it from orbit for a number of reasons. One was software licensing. It's unclear how many people, even a few years ago, had any of their open source licenses in order. And so a lot of people were, didn't want to disclose that they were, violating the GPL. But also, when you require something in regulation without knowing how to do it at scale, you're going to have a bad time. And so one of the things that I try to encourage folks who are interested in policy to do is to say, hey, if we're going to start requiring this, let's actually talk about what it looks like, think about scaling, and then have the regulator waiting in the wings to help foster adoption. So for example, in the United States, the regulator of medical devices, the FDA, has publicly told the medical device manufacturers they're going to be required to have this software bill of materials, but they aren't really dictating what it's going to look like. They instead have pointed the medical device community to this broader discussion, because we shouldn't have industry-specific or region-specific solutions for this. So that's some fun that we're trying to have, really building on this. Now, the fun thing, and I'll close on this, is I've been really excited about the enthusiasm for this software bill of materials work. And, you know, every time we have new headlines, there's more and more reason why we should have it. But the embarrassing thing is I also keep hearing from people from industry and people from very large companies who say, hey, I like this. I need this. This will make my job easier. But it's probably not, I'm not going to get the resources to do this inside my company until it's a compliance issue. And this is one of those little, you know, challenges that we face is at the end of the day, a lot of things, compliance doesn't necessarily give us the best security, but it does give us at least some resources inside an organization. So it's one of those fun things to think about. I'll shut up now and looking forward to hearing from my European colleagues.
Great, thanks, Alan. That's a very good introduction to an important but perhaps neglected thread of work. Next is Aristotelis Safarias of DG Connect. Aris, we've heard what America's planning, so to what extent are you allowed to tell us what Europe is planning?
Unfortunately, to a very small extent, but I have prepared a couple of just 3 slides. If everyone can just, I think everyone can everyone see the slides in full screen mode, let's say? Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. And I'd just like to point to a couple of things. So Alan mentioned carrots and sticks. Well, the European Commission, who I work for, does a bit of both. Of course, in people's minds, it's mostly about the sticks rather than the carrots. But and we do many things. I think it'll take up all my time just to list what we've done in and around cybersecurity. So what I prefer to do is, first of all, point to the importance of this particular conference and the themes we are speaking of, what I call the WEIS body of knowledge, when it comes to how we develop policy. So there's a specific piece of law called the, well, NIS Directive. I will skip the official title, which is, amongst other things, about cybersecurity risk management requirements on companies such as healthcare, transport companies, what our US friends would call critical infrastructure related companies. So when we draft the law now, we are revising it, and the announcement will come, unfortunately, on Wednesday. So I cannot divulge much. Everything's under embargo. But we need to look at, you know, in deciding the cost benefit of intervening in the market, we look at things like the cost of incidents, the return of security investment, incident reporting or breach notifications, and also the voluntary disclosure of incidents. And I've just put there, you know, bullet points, 3 of the papers that are from today's just session that are particularly relevant. I can also disclose that the paper on the Dutch case, we actually read it in preparing the NIS directive, the revision. So thank you for that. But then there are also, of course, other things that go a bit beyond, let's say, the pure economics of information security. We're also looking at the interdependencies between sectors and some EU particularities, I would say. As most people, I think, are aware, at least on this side of the Atlantic, you know, the EU is not one government. There are 27 sovereign governments. So cross-border effects and the single market are things we need to look at. Ross, I'm hearing some music in the background, which is, I think, a very suitable soundtrack to my slides, but that's okay. Now, specifically on vulnerabilities, I think here there are 2 sides. So from the user side, we as users or a company that's using software or other products, vulnerability management is a requirement under NIS. Of course, the law does not specify, you know, you have to do vulnerability management because it's at a much higher level. but it is expected as part of a good cybersecurity risk management program. And here again, I think a very pertinent paper on today's agenda, how to prioritize vulnerability response. And I think what's coming in the future is more the vulnerability from the vendor side. So how you handle, how you disclose, and how you assess vulnerabilities will come up in new product-related regulation. So in terms of conformity assessment, so how do you know your product is compliant with a regulation? Like how many vulnerabilities do you need to have in a product for it to be compliant? But of course, I'm just kidding. 200 vulnerabilities, too much. 199, not enough. But also how vulnerabilities and the vulnerability lifecycle is handled from a regulatory perspective. We've seen, I think, in the UK, certainly in the bill, in the law that has been discussed, a requirement for vulnerability disclosure point of contact. I think in California, there's something. I saw it mentioned also in the IoT Improvement Act over in the US. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how these things develop. And just a shout out to Alan, it's always good for Alan to do all the dirty work. So then we, the regulator sitting in the wings, have everything, well, more or less everything, Alan, ironed out by the time we have to apply it. But then also what's coming up is liability and safety. Like silly questions, like how bad does a vulnerability have to be in order for it to be a safety concern, or in order to hold a manufacturer liable? I mean, should you hold someone liable for one vulnerability, or just bad, no vulnerability handling product? And I've finally put there this quote from the European General Product Safety Directive, which defines a safe product, which will mean any product which under reasonably foreseeable conditions of use, does not present any risk or some risk, compatible, of course, with the product's use. So if you just look at all those, words in bold from a cybersecurity or information security perspective, I think we can realize all the challenges that we face as we move forward in this area. Yep, so that's it from me. Thanks, Ross. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Aris. Plenty to think of there. We're just, as you know, beginning to think of safety as well as security. And of course, we realize increasingly that the two are increasingly intertwined once we start getting software and communications in just about everything that we buy for more than about 10 euros and don't immediately eat and drink. Anyway, our fourth speaker is also from DG Connect at the European Commission, Christian de Cunha. Christian, the floor is yours. Would you care to unmute and start your video?
Yeah, I've unmuted, but I don't have permission to share my video. So it's probably because I haven't been able to have a haircut for so many months.
Well, speak to us then.
Okay.
Or Richard, is there something technical that needs to be done?
I don't know. It simply says host has disabled video. So, but anyway, I'll start. I work with Aris, as you say, in DG Connect. My recent background is in data protection and privacy. So I guess that's why you've invited me to join you. So thank you very much for the invitation. I've heard great things about this event, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I wanted to just give you a brief overview of where we are with data protection and privacy from an EU perspective, and also look at some of the global trends, in particular the crucial relationship between the EU and the US, as was mentioned in the intro by Ross. On the General Data Protection Regulation, when I was working for the European Data Protection supervisor, we used to say that the GDPR was the most important legal instrument for cybersecurity anywhere in the world. There's obviously overlap, but where we are 2.5 years on since it entered into force, is that, you know, if you look at the statistics, there's been an enormous amount of compliance activity and enforcement. The statistics are being updated now, but just a year ago there had already been 160,000 data breaches reported, and a couple of months ago the European Data Protection Board started to publish and update a database of cross-border cases, of which there are hundreds which have resulted in decisions. And you can search according to categories, and you can drill down into regions. But I just checked on data breach notifications. There were 19 which have resulted in a cross-border decision between at the level of the European Data Protection Board. And this week, I think it's tomorrow, that the first big cross-border decision on a big tech company is expected. That's on Twitter, regarding Twitter. I think that's due for tomorrow, with a fine expected, a big fine. So there are different opinions about the GDPR. Some express great disappointment that it hasn't delivered more, it hasn't changed business models, that there haven't been that many sort of eye-watering fines against Silicon Valley companies and so on. It's worth repeating that the GDPR was about harmonization fundamentally, that it's a minimum standard. It doesn't in itself outlaw business models, and also it builds on top of national procedural rules and national courts who are responsible for making decisions on particular cases that are brought and ruled on by the local data protection authority. So although it's a single regulation for the whole of the EU, it's still superimposed on a patchwork of legal cultures and rules. So we'll see how it evolves, but certainly on the ground, you know, there's now an entire class of data protection officers around Europe and around the world, and more than anything, perhaps it's raised public awareness of the importance of data protection. Alongside all of this, there's been e-privacy rules. The e-privacy directive dates back to 2002, updated in 2009, the so-called cookie rules. The Commission has I'm getting a bit of echo. These rules have been considered by many, including the Commission, to be outdated, and so we proposed a new regulation which would apply directly to the whole of the EU from 2017. It's been very controversial. No consensus has emerged yet. The German presidency tried to get agreement amongst the governments to a text which focused on the use of metadata, for example, focusing on the use of metadata and location data, and the protection of vital interest in epidemics and emergencies. They weren't successful, and so discussions continue. But we obviously are keen for the EU to adopt new rules on e-privacy as soon as possible, not least because it will secure devices from unlawful interference. In the meantime, discussions are advanced on an interim regulation within the privacy framework, which would make it necessary, which would enable online communication services, webmail, messaging services, etc., like Skype, to continue their existing practices of monitoring what happens across their network for child sexual abuse material. Moving on to the if you like, the more global dimension, in July this year, there was a European Court of Justice ruling on the so-called Schrems II case, which was a challenge by Max Schrems against the use of standard contractual clauses as a legal mechanism for transferring Facebook data from Europe to the US. The court took that opportunity to strike down the Privacy Shield agreement, which had been relied on by thousands of companies, whilst at the same time saying that standard contractual clauses themselves were valid per se, but that if they were going to be relied on to transfer data to the US, companies, data controllers had to look at them on a case-by-case basis. That's posed obviously a problem, because the court was basically saying that in their view there was no way you could say that the legal regime in the US was essentially equivalent in terms of the protections that it provided for Europeans and their data. So discussions are now taking place between the US and the EU. But if I could just pan back to conclude now, to look at what's happening on a global level. When I first started working in data protection about 10 years ago, most of the laws were in Europe and in a few other countries around the world, but now it's truly global. There's 142 countries when they were last counted at the end of 2019, which have data protection laws. They're expected to be over 200 in the next few years. The US, there's an enormous amount of development. It's a very developing situation. In California, a set of very, very stringent rules are about to come into force in the next couple of years. Even China has its own privacy law, which has some very strict rules. It was adopted in October, but of course they don't apply to the Communist Party. So where do we go from here? Well, as Ross mentioned at the beginning, there is a desire on the part of the EU to situate the general challenge of ensuring data flows within a wider framework of democracy and rule of law. I think my personal view is that I think China has focused minds as well, when you see it as being as a coercive surveillance state, with the situation in Xinjiang, the social credit system. There is a lot in common between the US and the EU. And in the document that was published by the European Commission on the 2nd of December, it called for intensive discussions on cybersecurity, safeguarding critical infrastructure, managing together the digital transition, but in particular also trying to find ways that we can converge on data governance and on facilitating free flow of data between the EU and the US. So that's an overview of where we are with these discussions. It's a fluid picture. But I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Christian. That was so those 4 talks have given us a very good starting point. And there was one question that I wanted to raise with all 4 panelists, see if anybody's got an answer to it before I throw the floor open to everybody else. And that is about the FireEye and SolarWinds issues that we have seen over the past couple of days. Now, in the specific case of FireEye, what's happened is that a security company had a collection of hacking tools which got stolen by somebody, may have been the Russians, North Koreans, who knows. And had this been anybody other than a security company, we would have expected instant responsible disclosure, so that the defenders had as much information about the tools that are now out there as the bad guys now have. Is there some way in which we can start to bring people like security companies within the framework of responsible disclosure, coordinated disclosure, call it what you mean, or call it what you like, and do we have the legal tools to start to enforce that? I suppose Alan might be first to have an opinion here, given what you've been saying so far, and then Ruth might have something to say about whether the FTC has a view and whether security companies should be promoting security and how. Alan.
Well, I'm going to say basic disclosure, which is to say you have one party and a local customer and one source, is a little different than when you have more complex disclosures, such as widely used open source, or in this case, widely deployed security tools, or as we've learned, evidence of compromise of widely deployed tools. And so there, right, you have a challenge of, right, who gets to be part of this inner circle, because there definitely was a lot of discussion happening. Disclosure, I was not part of that discussion, nor should I have been, right? I don't have that level of operational responsibility. I think as we've learned from FIRE, I think they handled it reasonably well, right? They were still not entirely sure which tools were disclosed, but now anyone trying to use those tools, if indeed it was the offensive tools, is going to tip their hand. One of the more complex things that I want to flag for you, that because right, rather than if you tell I'm a former academic, rather than answer the question, I'll say here's another way that problem is complicated, is right, some vulnerabilities that happened in hardware a few years ago, where we sort of had to say, okay, we found these flaws in the pre-compute in a couple of major chip manufacturers, and so the initial disclosure was with the manufacturers that use those chips. And in fact, there was a little bit of a challenge among policymakers about whether or not certain manufacturers should have been included in that, given that those manufacturers may have given that information to certain governments, even as other governments were left out of it. And so as we start to think about what the circle looks like, any attempt to really provide high-level universal guidelines is going to make a lot of people unhappy. So in this case, for FireEye, I look at what happened and say, I don't know what I would want them to do that was different in this case. And I think the fact that they've come forward and haven't gotten the appropriation of the security community, which is notoriously catty and snarky, I think speaks reasonably well to how they handled it.
Well, if I might press you on that
Please.
slightly, an open source sort of guy like me might say that they should actually open source the tools that were stolen so that we can see what they were doing, or at the very least give us a sufficiently detailed explanation of how these tools worked, that we can build reasonable defenses. Now, it may be that the tools included 0 days, in which case obviously the vendor should be informed in the usual way, but they may just have been exploiting configurations and other things that don't appear as CVSSs.
And I think there's a difference, right? This is the challenge of security being a massive distribution. I think I agree with you completely that, you know, if the world was made up of very mature organizations, then open sourcing them helps us. The challenge is we have a very thick tail. And so by I think the compromise, which is releasing the indicators of compromise, helps at least folks that aren't mature enough to defend against, you know, the cobalts and things like that, but still be able to plug this into their automated systems to know what to look for, helps us there in a way, because those organizations definitely would be victimized by anyone who wants to turn around and use it. So that's sort of the tension that I think we've done a decent job of saying, don't say nothing. You definitely have to share indicators of compromise. But let's at least aim at the organizations that are using commodity tools rather than specialized custom tools. Right. And I'll let you have the last word if you want to push back.
Ruth, do you want to add anything on top of what Alan has said?
Yeah, so I'll come at it from a different perspective, obviously not looking at any particular company or situation. I'll just say, you know, again, we're focused primarily on the interaction with consumers that businesses have, as well as some business interactions with each other. But we do look, when we're looking at companies, at what they've done to try to mitigate vulnerabilities and harms. And so we have talked a lot about notice to whoever the parties are to try to, shore up any problems or stop any issues. So to that extent, we've talked about that as important.
Yes, I see there's a question in the, before I go on to speak to Aris, I'm just going to mention this question that Rena has raised in the chat. In addition to public-private cooperation and coordinated vulnerability disclosure, are there any anticipated actions on the EU level harmonized vulnerability equities policy for the EU member states? Is this perhaps a relevant thing for the EU, Aris, or are there other instruments that might be relevant here?
Yeah, thank you, Ross. And so a couple of years ago, when we were doing the Cybersecurity Act, there was anyway a discussion about coordinated vulnerability disclosure, so the B2B or B2C, and that, I think, as you may or may not see in a couple of days, is something that has settled rather well. That vulnerability disclosure, coordinated vulnerability disclosure, is something that I think the broadest range of, let's say, stakeholders agree is a good thing, should be promoted, implemented. On the vulnerability equities process, it was mixed. And of course, speaking from the EU level, right? It may or may not touch upon issues that the Union or the Commission has remit over, especially when it comes to intelligence. There it's simply, not us looking at these things. But I do feel that it will come because we see that also the Hannes also mentioned the parts of government pushing against encryption. So as we see that encryption bypassing tools or alternative modes of investigation that someone would have thought that were for intelligence agencies now proliferate to law enforcement and other even parts of, let's say, just administrative agencies. I think it will come up. So and it will come up also at the EU level because it's, in our view, there's a strong, what we call single market perspective. Companies want certainty. They do not want to be faced in the EU with 27 different ways of doing things. So I'm sure it will come up, and there are some indications that it will definitely come up, because more and more EU member states are adjusting their laws to give these capabilities to their law enforcement agencies. So one thing will lead to another, and it will come up. Yes, I'm sure it will come up.
Right, yes, I can imagine that this will go on and on and on as we get the debates between equipment interference and intercept and so on and so forth that we've seen recently, for example, in the EncroChat cases, which are finding their way through the courts in a number of EU member states. Perhaps I should just go through the other questions in the chat now. Jean Camp says that you can take a risk and harm approach similar to toxic wastes. And so if a firm knowingly keeps highly toxic vulnerabilities, they might risk legal liability. This is something I heard earlier from somebody else, that if you keep bad things in a badly guarded locker in your front room and a burglar steals them, you then carry some liability for that. I wonder if there are any approaches either in US law or EU law which might be relevant in this case.
Well, I don't know about law, but Alan, if you can solve it for us in this one of these convening. Now, it's true that when a couple of years ago, there was, the Commission decided to take a look at the Product Liability Directive for a variety. So the Product Liability Directive is the EU law that's sets out the framework for what the name implies. You know, when is a vendor or a manufacturer liable for a defective product? And we have things like autonomy coming up and AI. So there are a lot of, let's say, conceptual challenges to liability, and cybersecurity and liability is something that has been discussed possibly as long as vulnerability disclosure. I think even Alan may have written a piece on this. But now, because our dependence on, as you mentioned, Ross, is, well, extensive, and there are impacts to safety, so cybersecurity in the context of liability has popped up again. So it will be something that we will need to look at, but it will have to be an informed debate. So, you know, concepts from the physical or the safety world make sense at the conceptual level, but then when you try to apply them directly on what it means from an information security perspective for a product to be defective, there it gets fuzzy. There are many papers out there, but we are certainly are going to discuss it in the next year or so.
Yes, Ruth, you had your hand up there.
Yeah, sorry. So I wanted to add also this kind of calculus is what we look at when we look at companies that are involved in incidents. We look at if they basically what their data security program looked like, or their security program, right? Whether they were taking good practices in general, if this is something that they've just been sitting on and ignoring for a long time. And we do look at that, and we hold companies liable. And one of the things that we do afterwards is in our orders, we basically require them to have a more comprehensive program of annual reviews by outside parties, that sort of thing. So we definitely do look at that. But again, it's company by company, right?
Yes, there is a twist to it, though, in the European Union, and that the Product Liability Directive deals with products, not with services. And this is something that we remarked on a few years ago when we wrote something for the Commission, namely that if you get a Garmin navigator and you drive off down to Cornwall with your caravan and you get stuck in a narrow lane and you have to hire a crane to get your caravan out and it costs you £1,000, you can sue Mr. Garmin. But if you use Google Maps, you can't, because that's a service, and the product liability applies to products, not to services. Now, this means that if you can provide something as a service, you escape a lot of liability. And so in equilibrium, you would expect everything dangerous to become a service and the Product Liability Directive to become ineffective. So one of the things that we suggested is revisiting the Product Liability Directive so that it covers services too. Aris, do you think there's any prospect of that?
I am sure, because in all the reports that have come so far, the concept of product itself is likely to change, also for liability and safety. So I think you will get your wish, Ross. I don't know how it will materialize, but definitely the concept of product limited to a tangible, independent, self-standing thing will not survive the next couple of years when it comes to liability and safety.
So, Ross, if I just jump in very quickly with the obligatory caveat that I speak just for myself, not my agency. I think if the thing that I find frustrating, a lot of discussions around liability, especially for software, is an emphasis on saying, well, let's try to capture what's bad. And as Aris has talked about, it gets quite complicated when you think about security without first saying, well, what do I have to do to avoid liability? Because if you're trying to affect change, for me, the starting point is what's the safe harbor, right? So, one way of asking it is, so assume Microsoft spends about $100 million in their overall security plan and operational consideration. Is that enough? If we would still manage to impose liability on them what hope do we have for a medium-sized enterprise? So what is it that someone has to do to clear the liability? And this gets back to, again, this tension. Risk-based security is how we need to think about security, but organizations don't hate thinking about it from a risk-based security perspective. They need to basically say, I've done enough, I can stop spending on security, and the rest goes to profit. And so for those who are thinking about this from an operational perspective, we need more smart people thinking about what safe harbor might look like. Yeah, I'll be quiet there.
Well, yes, this is something we've seen in a number of fields, for example, in medical devices, where in many cases the safe harbor isn't safe enough. And as people have pointed out, infusion pumps kill about as many people as motor cars do, but since the deaths are less public and conspicuous, there is less pressure to on the medical regulators to fix stuff up. The chat has a question from Jeff Hall. My concern is the speed with which we pump out updates or enhancements that are not fully tested when pushed. Security is attempting to be automated and is not always as fully vetted as it should be. This is another issue that we have dealt with at WEIS on 2 or 3 occasions over the last 2 or 3 years, namely updates. We keep on telling everybody updates are good. Vendors of things like cars and medical devices push back saying updates are expensive. And then the EU comes out with the Directive 771 of 2019 saying updates are mandatory for a reasonable period of time. And so this is becoming one of the real pain points. This is something we've discussed a bit in European circles, but I don't think we've discussed it as much in US circles. Ruth, Alan, I wonder if you've got any view on updates and to what extent should they be coerced, and what is the difference between a good update and a bad update, and how do you tell the difference?
Well, I know Alan's going to have a lot to say on this, but in the meantime, actually, the FTC commented on one of the voluntary codes of conduct, voluntary stakeholder initiatives that Alan's been working with. And again, kind of laid out how we see this from the perspective of an agency that's looking to protect consumers and not to get into the weeds about how a business does anything until there's a problem. And then we look at how everything was put together. So we did say, you know, there's a lot with consumer expectations and how much responsibility is being put on consumers, and that ultimately automated updates are better for consumers, right? Because they're not using, let's say, devices. If we talk about IoT devices that are old and have vulnerabilities that are known, and they're just sitting on them. But we understand that businesses do things differently. So it's really about, you know, what the situation is for the consumer and whether they are being put at risk without having any ability to do something about it. That's really what we're talking about.
And I think the challenge is, of course, what is the scope of what we're talking about? So if it's just, you know, a consumer device, or, you know, I have to wait 30 more seconds before I can log into my email, it's one thing. When a number of large enterprise applications or OT applications have updates, someone's not seeing their kids that night. And so we sort of want to think about how to do that in a timely fashion, in an organized and predictable fashion, because that is going to really interfere with availability. That compounded with the fact that it's built into regulation that says, hey, if a patch is available, you must apply it, then starts to be a little tricky, because what is the risk? So, you know, we're talking about vulnerabilities. Depending on how you measure it, in OpenSL 0.9, there are between 600 and 1,000 different function calls you can make. 2 of them call the heartbeat code that allows random read of memory in a server. And so do we say, hey, if you're using OpenSL 0.9 at all, because of Heartbleed, you need to update this? Or do we actually allow the supplier to make the decision about when they want to ship an update and what that risk looks like? And I don't think we have a good way of resolving that security tension, other than, you know, having more visibility into what the appropriate risk looks like, right? At a certain point, there has to, right? You just have this relationship between the supplier and the customer, and they're going to have to negotiate between, you know, is uptime versus the risk of security. What's that trade-off look like?
Yeah, thanks, Russ. And speaking of all things complicated, so apparently, and if I understood, you know, what's going on today or what we're reading about today, the actual vulnerability was introduced through an update. You know, so there was a software that was running, the network management software. It was somebody managed, and of course this is speculation, right? Just based on press reports. So somebody managed to compromise the secure development, the development procedures of the vendor, introduced a malicious code. That code was then pushed out automatically to all the clients, because we keep telling people that you should accept automatic updates because that's best for you. And there we have it. So I think, I mean, and looking a bit of the time, my impression is the following, that there are concepts that we as citizens are used to in other worlds, in, you know, safety, in tangible products, that I think increasingly we expect to see in the digital world. But how we get there, I think will be a very interesting journey. And we'll welcome, of course, to have you all on board with us, and on both sides, of course, of the Atlantic, and to the east and the north and the south. And as you know what they say, in the internet has no borders.
Yes, well, that's a big challenge, I think, that's going to be facing all of us, probably over the rest of our working lives. But it's fascinating how in a panel like this, we've been able to pull together so many WEIS core issues that we've worked on now going back about 20 years, and which still give us a core of important things for people both of a technological background and also of an economics and policy background to chew on. And these two approaches are going to be, I'm sure, thoroughly entangled in the years ahead. So many thanks to our panelists for coming along and giving us the views on both sides of the Atlantic from two different perspectives in each case. And thanks to everybody for coming along to WEIS. And we hope we'll see you again tomorrow at 1 p.m. UTC, 2 p.m. Brussels time, and whatever according to your local time zone. And that we'll continue with the fascinating work of exploring what security economics is about, what it could be about, and what it might be about in future research. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.